The hushed reverence of the auction house back room was a language I understood as intimately as the silent declarations of the dead. Here, among the velvet-draped tables and the hushed whispers of connoisseurs, history was bought and sold, its narrative meticulously catalogued, its secrets polished for public consumption. Tonight promised a record sale, and the air thrummed with a nervous energy that was almost palpable. But I, Marcus, wasn't here for the thrill of the gavel. My hands, usually gloved and precise in the field, were bare as I ran a finger over the pitted surface of an ancient astrolabe. It was part of William 317, a collection of maritime instruments purportedly salvaged from a colonial-era wreck off the coast of Zara, England. The official provenance was impeccable, yet my eyes, trained to spot the anomaly, lingered on a faint, almost imperceptible inscription on the instrument's reverse. It wasn't a maker's mark, nor a navigational coordinate. It was a series of abstract symbols, etched with a crude yet deliberate hand, unlike anything I'd ever seen in period pieces. My unique approach to forensic anthropology wasn't confined to bones. It extended to the stories objects told, the silent narratives of human endeavor, suffering, and mystery. I saw the past not as a linear timeline, but as a complex tapestry, and every thread, every knot, every stain held significance. Fascinating, isn't it, Marcus? The voice belonged to Arthur Finch, the auction house's lead appraiser, a man whose encyclopedic knowledge of antiquities was only rivaled by his talent for extracting exorbitant prices. He hovered beside me, a faint scent of old paper and expensive cologne clinging to him. A genuine rarity, most likely a personal touch from a particularly superstitious captain. We've had a few inquiries already. I hummed, non-committal, my gaze still fixed on the peculiar markings. Superstition, perhaps, or something else entirely. The symbols tugged at a distant memory, a pattern I'd encountered once in a forgotten ethnographic text, but couldn't quite place. It was the kind of detail most would overlook, a mere aesthetic curiosity. But to me, it was a question, an unresolved chord in the symphony of the past. Arthur, used to my often cryptic pronouncements, merely smiled. Well, whatever its origins, it adds to its mystique, and its value, I assure you. He checked his watch. 5 minutes to the main event. You'll stay for the show, I trust? Perhaps, I said, finally pulling my attention from the astrolabe. My phone vibrated in my pocket, an unfamiliar number. I excused myself, stepping away from the bustling preparations towards a quieter corner near a stack of crated Emma paintings. Marcus Thorne, I answered, my voice low. Marcus, it's Detective Miller. I'm sorry to bother you at what I assume is a rather sophisticated engagement, but we've got something. Something really out there. Miller's voice was usually a study in calm, professional detachment. Now there was an edge of barely suppressed astonishment. Out where, detective? I asked, already feeling the shift in my mental landscape. The subtle reorientation from the world of auctioned history to the brutal realities of the present. Remote. Very remote. And the circumstances. They're unprecedented. We found them in a cave system, deep inland, in an area that's supposedly geologically stable. No known fault lines, no history of significant seismic activity. My brow furrowed. Them? Remains? Skeletal, or what should be skeletal, Miller clarified, a pause as if he were struggling for the right words. That's the thing, Marcus. They're preserved. Not mummified in any way we understand. Not petrified. It's like they just stopped decaying. And the location itself is baffling. A dry cave system, yes, but the conditions aren't right for this kind of preservation. Not even close. This was precisely the kind of anomaly that ignited my professional curiosity. Not just a death, but a defiance of the natural order. And the markings? I prompted, recalling the astrolabe. My intuition, honed over decades of deciphering the silent language of bones, told me there was more. You always know, don't you? Yes. Peculiar markings. On the bones themselves. And on some artifacts found with them. Symbols, Marcus. Unlike anything our experts have ever logged, etched, almost carved into the bone. Not post-mortem damage. It looks deliberate. Ancient. And frankly, a little disturbing. The auctioneer's booming voice suddenly cut through the backroom's quiet, announcing the start of the sale. William won, a rare Maya Seth vase. The world of high art and historical commerce receded, replaced by the stark, compelling image of ancient bones. Defying decay, marked by an unknown hand, in a place that made no sense. "Send me the coordinates, detective," I said, already striding towards the exit, my mind racing. The astrolabe's strange symbols flashed in my memory. "I'll be there as soon as I can." The back room, once a vibrant tableau of human ambition, now felt like a mere stage prop, a brief interlude before the curtain rose on a much older, far more profound mystery. The dead were calling, and their story, I knew, would be unlike any I had ever heard. The back room, once a vibrant tableau of human ambition, now felt like a mere stage prop, a brief interlude before the curtain rose on a much older. My eyes, accustomed to the stark realities of human cruelty, swept over the scene, taking in the macabre still life before me. The air, usually thick with the scent of aged paper and polished wood, now carried a metallic tang, sharp and unmistakable. I moved with the methodical precision of a predator, yet my purpose was not to consume, but to dissect. My gaze settled first on the victim, a man sprawled awkwardly amidst what should have been a trove of priceless artifacts. He lay on his back, arms splayed, a posture that suggested both a violent fall and a deliberate arrangement. The expensive suit, now rumpled and stained, spoke of a man of means, someone who frequented such establishments, perhaps even a potential buyer for the night's record-breaking sale. My initial assessment began before I even donned my gloves. From a distance, I estimated his age to be in the late 60s, perhaps early 70s. His face, pale and still, bore the etched lines of a life lived, though now frozen in a silent scream that never quite formed. His hands, visible despite the slight disarray of his cuffs, were well manicured, the skin loose, betraying the passage of time. There was no wedding ring, but a heavy signet ring adorned his left pinky, a crest I didn't immediately recognize, but which undoubtedly held significance. This wasn't a vagrant. This was someone important, or at least someone who thought they were. Moving closer, my attention narrowed to the cause of death. A single catastrophic wound dominated the left side of his chest, a deep, ragged puncture that had clearly been the instrument of his demise. This was not a struggle, not a random act of violence. This was precise, impactful, and delivered with intent. The surrounding area was surprisingly clean, almost as if the killer had taken pains to limit the spread, or perhaps the victim had simply collapsed instantly. But it was the other details that truly snagged my attention, the ones that had clearly eluded the initial responders. The local detective, a man named Miller, had called me in with a sense of frustrated bewilderment. He'd described it as just a messy murder. But I knew better. There was nothing just about this. My eyes drifted from the fatal wound to the man's exposed torso. Below the collar of his shirt, just above the sternum, I noted a series of shallow, almost delicate incisions. They weren't deep enough to be fatal, nor did they appear to be defensive wounds. Instead, they formed a distinct, intricate pattern. A series of interlocking triangles, almost like a stylized symbol. They were precise, made with a blade different from the one that delivered the fatal blow, and clearly inflicted before the killing strike, or at least. The edges were clean, not jagged, suggesting a steady hand and a purpose beyond mere mutilation. Then, the post-mortem treatment. This was the truly confounding element. Not just shut, but sealed, as if by a gentle hand. And resting on his tongue, just visible through his slightly parted lips, was an ancient coin. Its placement was too meticulous to be accidental, too symbolic to be dismissed as a random object. It was an offering, a payment, a ritualistic gesture completely out of place in the grimy reality of a modern murder. This wasn't about theft. The expensive watch was still on his wrist, the signet ring untouched. And his team, focused on the obvious cause of death and the immediate circumstances, had seen the coin as an oddity, perhaps a clue to the victim's hobby, or a bizarre calling card. They had noted the shallow cuts, but dismissed them as superficial damage, perhaps from a struggle. But I saw the deliberate pattern, the careful closing of the eyes, the symbolic coin. These were not random acts. The back room, with its silent inventory of human history, had become the stage for a ritual, a macabre performance that had unfolded just hours before the grand auction. And I, Marcus, was now charged with understanding its language. The Bacchic undertones were unmistakable, a primal ritualistic act performed in the sterile calm of a back room before a record sale. I'd seen a lot of death, but never one so deliberately theatrical, so steeped in a forgotten language. Someone had sought not just to end this man's life, but to mark his passing, to send him on his way according to an ancient, forgotten custom. I stepped back, allowing the crime scene photographers to do their work, their flashes illuminating the silent tableau. My mind, however, was already racing, sifting through the layers of the presentation. The body, the way it was positioned, the specific items laid out. These weren't random. They spoke volumes if you knew how to read them. This wasn't a crime of passion, nor was it a simple robbery gone wrong. This was a message, a declaration, or perhaps a sacrifice. What are your thoughts, Marcus? His voice, a low rumble, stood beside me, his gaze fixed on the victim. He wasn't one for idle chatter, preferring to let the evidence speak, but he knew I saw things differently. This isn't just murder, I began, choosing my words carefully. This is a performance. The specific arrangement of the body, the items. It points to a very particular belief system, or at least a powerful inspiration drawn from one. It's ancient, detective, not necessarily in practice today, but certainly in its symbolism. I gestured vaguely toward the scene. Consider the setting. An auction house, a place where history is bought and sold, where artifacts of forgotten cultures exchange hands. The victim, whoever he was either involved in this world, or he was brought here for a very specific reason related to it. Nodded, absorbing my words. So, you're saying we should look for people involved in ancient cults? Or just history buffs? There was a hint of skepticism in his tone, but also a genuine desire for direction. More refined than that, I clarified. The specifics of the ritual, the pose, the objects, they aren't universal. They're drawn from a particular tradition. We need to look for individuals or groups who have a deep, perhaps obsessive interest in obscure ancient practices. Not just general history, but specific, perhaps even esoteric historical rituals. Think collectors of unusual antiquities, academics specializing in forgotten religions, even online communities dedicated to such pursuits. And cross-reference that with anyone who's recently gone missing, particularly those with connections to the world of artifacts or historical societies. My suggestion was a long shot. I knew, but it was the only logical next step given the sheer peculiarity of the crime. If the killer was enacting a ritual, they likely had a deep understanding of its components and perhaps sought out a victim who, in their twisted logic, fit the criteria for such a sacrifice. Hours later, hunched over lukewarm coffee in the precinct, called me over. We ran your parameters, Marcus, and surprisingly we got a hit. A man named Arthur Finch, a known antiquities dealer specializing in Greco-Roman artifacts. He's been reported missing for the last 72 hours. No forced entry at his apartment, no signs of struggle, just gone. His last known public appearance was at a private viewing right here at the auction house 2 nights ago. My heart gave a jolt. This was it. Arthur Finch, in the very historical period whose rituals seemed to inspire the tableau in the back room. It was too perfect. Was already dispatching a team to Finch's apartment and another to interview his associates. The next day, the lead was dead. The police had found Arthur Finch, alive and well, albeit disoriented, in a small, out-of-the-way bed and breakfast an hour's drive from the city. He'd gone on an impromptu digital detox retreat, leaving his phone and wallet behind, a habit his exasperated family knew all too well. He had an ironclad alibi for the time of the murder, confirmed by multiple witnesses at the retreat. He hadn't even been near the auction house that night. Looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. So, no ancient cult connections, no missing antiquities dealer, just a guy who likes to disappear for a few days. I ran a hand through my hair, a knot forming in my stomach. The ritual is still there, Detective. The details are too specific to be a coincidence. But if the victim wasn't Arthur Finch, and if he had no obvious connection to these practices, then we're dealing with something far more complex. My initial insight, while accurate in identifying the nature of the crime, had led us down a cul-de-sac. The killer wasn't just following an ancient custom. They were either selecting victims completely unrelated to that custom, or the victim's connection was so deeply hidden it defied immediate detection. The carefully staged scene, which I'd so confidently described as a message, now felt like a veil, obscuring the true motive, the true identity of both the victim and the killer. I'd been so focused on a specific period, a particular cultural practice, that I'd missed the forest for a single gnarly tree. The evidence, the markings, the very method. I'd so painstakingly pieced together, it all pointed to a specific ritualistic pattern. But I'd assumed the pattern itself was the genesis, not merely a manifestation. A hushed tip-off, vague and almost dismissive, had led me to the back rooms of Beaumont & Sons, an auction house known for its discretion and the staggering prices its rare items commanded. They were preparing for their annual Lost Legacies sale, an event that drew collectors of the truly esoteric. My contact, a man who saw more of history pass through his hands than most academics did in a lifetime, had mentioned a certain lot, a collection of artifacts unearthed from a previously uncatalogued dig in the Near East. Nothing to do with my case, he'd insisted, but the phrase unusual iconography had snagged in my mind like a burr. Rows of display cases, some still draped in protective cloths, lined the walls. Assistants in white gloves moved with practiced reverence, cataloging, dusting, and positioning items under the glare of task lights. The controlled chaos was a stark contrast to the sterile quiet of my lab. Yet both places dealt in fragments of the past, albeit for very different purposes. Here, history was a commodity. For me, it was a weapon, a key. "Marcus, good to see you," a voice rumbled. It was Bartholomew Beaumont, the owner, a man whose encyclopedic knowledge of antiquities was matched only by his formidable business acumen. He gestured towards a secured area. "The Near East collection is over here, still unpacking some of it. Fascinating stuff. Mostly funerary, some domestic, but there's a few pieces that are unique." He left me to it, understanding my need for solitude. I moved among the crates, past sarcophagi fragments and clay tablets inscribed with forgotten scripts. My eyes scanned for any anomaly, any symbol that might align with the unique, almost impossibly complex mark I'd found carved into the bones of our victims. The mark was so distinct, so alien to any known historical lexicon I'd studied, that it felt almost impossible for it to exist outside the context of the recent murders. Then I saw it. It wasn't a set of remains, nor was it a document. It was a small, intricately carved obsidian plinth, no larger than my hand, nestled among a collection of Bronze Age tools. My breath hitched. incised into its center with an unnerving precision that defied the passage of time, was the exact same symbol. My mind reeled. The mark. It was identical. The same looping angular lines, the same central motif that resembled a stylized, impossible eye. It wasn't just similar. It was a perfect match. But this plinth, it was clearly, unequivocally ancient. The patina of age, the mineral deposits in the etched lines, the very material itself screamed of a time long before any of our victims walked the earth. This wasn't a killer's modern interpretation of an ancient sign. This was the ancient sign. And it wasn't on human remains. It was on an object, a ritualistic artifact perhaps, or a decorative piece. This changed everything. My initial theory, that the killer was meticulously recreating a specific, obscure ancient ritual, suddenly felt small, almost naive. The mark wasn't just a signature for a modern practitioner of a forgotten cult. It was a symbol with a far deeper, far more enduring history than I had ever imagined. It wasn't merely a sign of a particular act, but perhaps a sign of a philosophy, a belief system, or even a hidden society that had persisted across vast stretches of human history. The implications crashed over me like a tidal wave. If this symbol had existed for millennia, then the current murders weren't just an isolated resurgence. They were part of a much larger, unbroken, and terrifying lineage. The killer wasn't just a follower. They were a continuation. The ancient custom I'd been tracking was merely one manifestation of something far more pervasive, a root system reaching deep into the bedrock of time, occasionally sending up a poisonous shoot. This obsidian plinth, a silent sentinel from a forgotten era, had just shattered my entire understanding of the case. The narrative had twisted, sending me down a new, far more treacherous path. The hunt had just become infinitely more complex and infinitely more terrifying. My focus had been too narrow, my historical lens too short-sighted. This obsidian, it wasn't just a tool or even an artifact of a known period, but a profound, almost impossible question mark. My initial assessment, clouded by the immediate context of the auction house and its historical inventory, had been a superficial skim. Now, looking at the crude yet deliberate flaking of the obsidian, at the faint, almost imperceptible residues clinging to its edges, I knew I needed to dig deeper. This wasn't a case for conventional forensics. It was a deep dive into antiquity, demanding techniques that could coax secrets from the very fabric of time. I carefully secured samples from the victim's remains, fragments of bone, traces of hair, even minute specks of preserved tissue. From the obsidian, I collected microsamples from its surface, its edges, and any embedded debris. These, along with soil and dust from the immediate vicinity, were then transported to a specialized forensic archaeology laboratory. This wasn't a sterile medical facility. It was a place of quiet hums and focused light, where the past could be meticulously dissected on a molecular level. The first technique I employed was ancient DNA analysis. The challenge lay in working with DNA that had been degraded over centuries, exposed to the elements, and handled by countless hands. My team and I used advanced capture methods and high-throughput sequencing to painstakingly piece together genetic fragments. The initial results were staggering. The victim's mitochondrial DNA, passed down through the maternal line, showed haplogroups that were exceedingly rare in modern populations, but remarkably common in specific ancient populations of this region. It wasn't just a general ancient lineage. It pointed to a distinct, long-vanished indigenous group known to have inhabited these very valleys thousands of years ago. A group whose cultural footprint was largely confined to archaeological sites. This individual wasn't just old. They were a direct descendant, a living echo of the land's original inhabitants. Next, I turned to isotope mapping. This technique involved analyzing the ratios of stable isotopes, non-radioactive variants of elements like carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and strontium, found in the victim's bone, tooth enamel, and hair. Each element told a different story. The carbon and nitrogen isotopes in the bone provided a snapshot of their long-term diet, revealing a lifestyle heavily reliant on wild game and specific types of native plants, rather than domesticated crops. The oxygen isotopes in their tooth enamel formed in childhood indicated the water sources they consumed during their formative years, mapping precisely to the unique hydrological signature of the local river system and its tributaries. Most remarkably, the strontium isotopes in their teeth and bones, which reflect the geological bedrock of the place they lived, showed an undeniable match to the distinctive volcanic rock formations that dominated this particular valley, the very same geological source from which the obsidian itself was likely quarried. The victim had not merely visited this land, they had been of this land, from birth to death, intimately connected to its soil and water. Finally, I initiated advanced trauma reconstruction. Using micro-CT scans of the skeletal remains, I created a detailed 3D digital model of the victim's injuries. This wasn't just about identifying the wound. It was about understanding the mechanics of its creation. We analyzed the fracture patterns, the depth and angle of penetration, and the precise morphology of the cut marks. The obsidian, with its razor-sharp conchoidal fracture edges, was then subjected to a similar microanalysis. Under powerful electron microscopes, we examined its cutting edge for microscopic wear patterns and any adhering residues. The reconstruction software, fed with data on material properties and force dynamics, allowed us to simulate the impact. This wasn't just a historical artifact found near the victim. It was the instrument of their death. The trauma indicated a swift, brutal attack, delivered with considerable force. Synthesizing these findings painted a vivid, almost unbelievable picture. The victim was not a modern individual, but from an ancient past, genetically linked to the earliest inhabitants of this specific valley. Their diet and water consumption confirmed a life lived entirely within the local ecosystem, thriving on its unique resources. And the obsidian, quarried from the very bedrock of their homeland, was the weapon that ended their life. This wasn't just a crime. It was a historical narrative violently interrupted. The victim wasn't merely a body. They were a living piece of forgotten history, brought to a sudden, brutal halt by a tool forged from their own ancestral lands. The auction house, with its glittering modern treasures, had unknowingly become the final resting place for a secret far older, far more rooted in the very earth beneath our feet. This discovery didn't just shift my investigation. It upended everything I thought I knew about the timeline of this place. The real story had begun not weeks or months ago, but millennia. The air in the back room, thick with the scent of old paper and dust, suddenly felt charged with ghosts. I moved past the yellow tape, my eyes scanning the chaotic scene, not just for clues, but for a story. The victim, Mr. Thorne, had clearly been engrossed in his work. Manuscripts lay scattered, some unbound, others in leather folios. A magnifying glass rested near an open book, its pages brittle and yellowed. Familiar. I knelt, my gloved fingers hovering over the box. The carving was deep, almost primal. Intertwined oak leaves, a coiled serpent, and at its center, a stylized, jagged star. A prickle ran down my spine. I'd seen that star before. Not in a book, not in a museum, but in a faded photograph, tucked away in my grandmother's old cedar chest. A memory, as faint and elusive as wood smoke, began to coalesce. Summers at my grandmother's house in Oakhaven, the town where I was born but had left as a child. Stories of Oakhaven's true beginnings, of a pact made long ago, of a price paid. The official town history never mentioned it. The jagged star was etched onto the oathstone in her stories. This wasn't just a random murder in an auction house. This was Oakhaven. This was my Oakhaven. The victim, Thorne, had been researching something connected to this legend, something he'd found or sought in this very back room. The significance of the record sale suddenly shifted. Was the item for sale the oathstone itself? Anything interesting there, Marcus?" I straightened abruptly, his voice cutting through my thoughts. He stood a few feet away, observing me with a mild curiosity that felt like scrutiny. I kept my face neutral. Just a curious carving, detective. Trying to date it. I gestured vaguely at the box. He nodded, but his eyes lingered on the box for a beat too long. Antique, I imagine. This place is full of them. Mister, he knew about the legends. He knew about the ghosts. And he seemed to be suggesting I shouldn't go digging. "Depends on the ghost, I suppose," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "Sometimes they just want to tell their story." He offered a tight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I looked back at the wooden box. The jagged star seemed to pulse with an almost imperceptible light. My grandmother's warnings, her hushed tones, her insistence that some secrets were too dangerous to unearth, flooded my mind. She'd even mentioned a specific ancestor, a woman named Ilara, who had defied the original pact. Ilara. The name resonated. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was personal. The past wasn't just knocking. It was clawing its way out, demanding to be heard. And someone, perhaps someone very powerful in this town, wanted to ensure it remained silent. I had a feeling wasn't the only one who wanted me to stop looking. Not now. It was half hidden beneath a stack of auction catalogs, as if Thorne had been trying to conceal it, or perhaps had just pulled it out before his death. She called it the Oath Stone, a sacred artifact, supposedly lost, upon which the town's founders had sworn their allegiance to the land, ensuring its prosperity. But she always added, with a shake of her head, that the prosperity came with a cost, a debt that needed to be periodically paid. Thorne was quite the collector, and quite the historian, apparently. He paused, then added, "Though some histories are best left undisturbed, wouldn't you agree? Especially the ones that stir up old ghosts." It was said so casually, almost like an aside, yet it landed with the weight of a veiled warning. My gaze met his, and for a fleeting moment, I saw something in his eyes. Not malice, but a deep-seated weariness. An understanding that went beyond the immediate crime. Or sometimes they just want to stay buried. He turned away then, moving towards a uniformed officer, but the implication hung in the air like a shroud. She'd always told me our family, though not among the founding families of Oakhaven, had been the silent keepers of the true story, the ones who remembered the debt. The victim's research, the cryptic box, subtle warning. It all pointed to something far deeper than a simple robbery gone wrong. Glass display cases, lit with surgical precision, held treasures that would soon exchange hands for fortunes. I, however, was focused on a single, unassuming item, a small bone plaque, no larger than my palm, nestled amongst a tray of miscellaneous archaic carvings. A deliberate misdirection I now understood. Had been right. This plaque, meticulously retrieved from the box's hidden compartment, was the key. Its surface was a tapestry of ancient symbols, weathered by centuries, its ivory-like material yellowed with age. The auction staff, oblivious, had catalogued it as a minor curiosity, a piece of tribal art. To my forensic eye, it was a screaming anomaly. I'd set up my portable examination kit on a discreet side table, a compact array of lenses, lights, and calipers. The auctioneer, a man whose tailored suit seemed to hum with suppressed anticipation, had granted me access under the guise of pre-sale authentication for a different, more prominent lot. He'd barely glanced at the bone fragment, preoccupied with the upcoming record sale. Good. That suited my purpose perfectly. Under the harsh beam of my focused LED, the plaque's surface came alive. The victim's notes had alluded to these symbols, hinting at a complex system of astronomical or calendrical significance. I traced the raised lines with a gloved finger, feeling the smooth, cool texture of the ancient bone. My gaze settled on a particular symbol, a stylized spiral that the victim had marked with a tiny X in his journal. It was, according to his fragmented research, the anchor symbol, central to the entire system. I brought my jeweler's loupe to my eye, magnifying the delicate work. The spiral was deeply incised, its edges softened by millennia. But then I saw it. Within the very core of the spiral, almost invisible to the naked eye, was a series of microstriations. They weren't part of the original carving. The ancient artisan, using primitive bone tools, would have left irregular organic marks, a testament to the human hand. These were different. These were impossibly fine, perfectly parallel lines, almost like the tracks of a microscopic sled. They possessed a uniformity, a precision that screamed, modern. I adjusted the loupe, angling the light, trying to convince myself it was an illusion, a trick of the light or an ancient imperfection. But no, the lines were too crisp, too consistent. They were superimposed, almost etched into the ancient groove itself, beneath the patina of age, but unmistakably newer. I pulled out a pair of specialized microcalipers, measuring the width of the striations. They were uniform, each less than 1/10 of a millimeter wide. This wasn't the work of a chisel, a knife, or even a needle. This was the work of a machine, a laser, or perhaps a diamond-tipped micro-etcher capable of incredible precision. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Someone had tampered with this ancient relic. Not just tampered, but modified it with advanced technology. Why? The victim's research had centered on the meaning of these symbols, their sequential order, their power. If this anchor symbol, the linchpin of the entire system, had been subtly altered, its entire context could be changed. I dismissed it as poetic musing. Now it was a literal description. Someone had written new data onto this ancient artifact. This wasn't just a unique toolmark. It was a signature, a method, and a motive all rolled into one. The perpetrator wasn't just stealing ancient artifacts. They were manipulating them. This wasn't about monetary value in the traditional sense. It was about controlling information, or perhaps activating something. The modern intervention on this ancient piece connected the dots between the victim's historical research and his brutal, very contemporary death. His warning about something far deeper echoed in my mind. This wasn't a random act. This was a targeted strike against someone who had stumbled upon a high-stakes game of historical fabrication or control. The perpetrator possessed not just the knowledge to identify such a crucial artifact, but also the sophisticated means to modify it. My fingers tightened around the plaque. The auction house, with its glittering display of wealth, suddenly felt like a facade. Beneath the veneer of legitimate trade, a far more dangerous game was being played. And I had just found the first undeniable clue to the identity of the player. My fingers tightened around the plaque, the cool bronze a stark contrast to the sudden heat that flushed through me. This wasn't just a relic, it was a key. The stylized serpent, coiled around an inverted crescent, was unmistakable. Guardians of what they called the original way. For generations, these stories had been dismissed as mere superstition, the ramblings of the uneducated. Now, holding this plaque, I knew they were anything but. This was a mark, a sigil, a badge of belonging to something far older and far more sinister than anyone had dared to imagine. I spotted near a display case, examining a set of antique firearms with a casual air that belied his sharp intelligence. I moved towards him, my stride purposeful, the plaque now hidden in my palm. The cacophony of murmuring voices, the clinking of champagne flutes, the gentle rustle of expensive fabrics. It all seemed distant, irrelevant. "Detective," I said, my voice low, cutting through the ambient noise. He turned, his gaze assessing. "Marcus, everything all right? The big sale starts in an hour." I held out the plaque. "Look at this. Not the value, but the symbols." He took it, his brow furrowing as his eyes traced the serpentine design. "Interesting. Old, certainly. Tribal? More than tribal, I corrected, leaning closer so only he could hear. This isn't just an artifact. This is a membership token, a signifier. The serpent and crescent. It's the emblem of the old blood, the keepers of the ancient traditions. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of understanding replacing the initial curiosity. The traditions you've been chasing? The missing people? The rituals? Precisely, I confirmed. This isn't just a myth anymore. This is physical proof, and more importantly, it points to a specific group, or even a family. A very old family deeply rooted in this community. We found a quiet corner in a disused office, away from the pre-auction frenzy. Laid the plaque on a dusty table. All right, Marcus, break it down for me. How does this help? The old blood isn't just a name, I explained, gesturing to the plaque. It's a lineage. Families who claim direct descent from the original settlers, who supposedly brought these traditions with them. They're influential, discreet, and utterly devoted to their ancestral ways. This plaque, if it's what I think it is, would have been passed down or worn as a secret mark of allegiance. He picked it up again. So, we're looking for someone from a specific family, someone with power, with roots. Exactly. Someone who could orchestrate these disappearances, these sacrifices, without drawing suspicion. Someone whose name carries weight, whose family history is intertwined with the very fabric of this town. We spent the next hour poring over what limited information we had access to a database of prominent local families, those with centuries of history in the region. We cross-referenced known land ownership, historical records, even old, forgotten newspaper clippings. Most of it was circumstantial, but the plaque was a filter. The serpent and crescent, I murmured, my finger tracing the symbol on the bronze. It's a specific variation, not just any old serpent. It's depicted in local legends as the guardian of the threshold. Typed furiously on his tablet, cross-referencing the symbol with historical crests and family emblems. The list of potential suspects, initially a daunting catalog of the town's elite, began to shrink. Many families had animal motifs, but none matched the exact unsettling depiction on the plaque. Then, a name flashed on the screen, highlighted in red due to its unusual historical consistency with certain land deeds and archaic legal documents. A family whose crest, though modernized, bore a striking resemblance to the ancient symbol. A family whose patriarch was not only a pillar of the community, but also a significant figure in the local historical society. No, breathed, leaning back, his face pale. It can't be. Why not? I pressed, my heart pounding. Who is it? He looked at me, a grim realization dawning in his eyes. It's the family that owns a significant portion of the Old North Woods. The same woods where the first disappearances were reported generations ago. The same family that has consistently, quietly bought up any land that bordered those ancient sites. The name hung in the air, unsaid, but understood. This individual was a ghost in plain sight, a wolf in sheep's clothing, their cunning woven into the very fabric of their public persona. They had cultivated an image of respectability, of dedication to the town's heritage, all while secretly upholding traditions that demanded a terrible price. Cunning, and dedicated to upholding their ancient traditions. Nodded slowly. They're not just a suspect, Marcus. They're the only suspect. And they're someone we all know. Someone who has been under our noses the entire time. A shiver ran down my spine, deeply embedded in the very community we were trying to protect. The auction house, with its impending record sale, suddenly felt less like a place of commerce and more like a stage set for a final dangerous act. A shiver ran down my spine. The hunt had just become terrifyingly personal. That a cornered wolf was the most dangerous kind. The air in the auction house's main back room was a symphony of hushed efficiency and barely contained anticipation. This wasn't the genteel, carpeted quiet of the main gallery, but a bustling, high-stakes ecosystem. Curators in white gloves made last-minute inspections. Security personnel in crisp uniforms moved with an almost imperceptible vigilance. And nervous assistants ferried documents and small, impossibly valuable items between secure vaults and display tables. Tonight's record-breaking sale was mere hours away, and the energy hummed like a taut wire. I stood beside, feigning interest in a particularly ornate Fabergé egg. My eyes, however, were scanning the room, dissecting every movement, every face. My gut churned, a familiar pre-hunt sensation. We had intel, fragmented but insistent, that our target would make a move tonight, either to retrieve something vital or to ensure its destruction before it could fall into our hands. This back room, a treasure trove of history and wealth, was the perfect stage. Then I saw him. Not the face I'd built in my mind from grainy surveillance photos, but the posture, the almost imperceptible tension in his shoulders as he leaned over a magnificent Louis XVI writing desk. The very piece I'd flagged as potentially significant. He was disguised as one of the auction house's specialist appraisers, complete with a discreet name badge and a pair of reading glasses perched on his nose. He blended in, but my senses screamed. The way his gaze flickered, not at the desk's intricate marquetry, but at the surrounding security cameras. The subtle clench of his jaw. He knew, or he suspected. Our eyes met across the room just for a fraction of a second. It was enough. A flicker of recognition, then pure, unadulterated panic flashed in his eyes, quickly replaced by a steely resolve. The wolf was cornered. He didn't hesitate. His gloved hand, which had been resting casually on the desk's surface, moved with a sudden, practiced precision. A small, almost invisible catch on the desk's side panel clicked. He was accessing a hidden compartment. This wasn't about admiration. It was about extraction. "He's making his move," I hissed, already pushing off the wall, my hand instinctively going to my sidearm. Was a half step behind me, already barking orders into his comms. It was quick, almost too quick to follow. Then, to create a diversion, he flung his arm wide, sweeping a priceless Ming Dynasty vase off its pedestal nearby. The crash was deafening, a sickening symphony of shattering porcelain and splintering wood that echoed through the high-ceilinged room. A collective gasp rose from the startled staff. Shards of ancient ceramic exploded across the polished floor, glinting like dangerous jewels. A nearby assistant screamed, stumbling backwards, narrowly avoiding being hit by a flying piece of the vase. Chaos erupted. Security guards, momentarily disoriented by the sudden, violent destruction of a multi-million-dollar artifact, looked wildly around, but wasn't waiting. His eyes already fixed on a service exit at the far end of the back room. "Stop him!" I roared, my voice cutting through the rising din. My legs pumped, adrenaline surging through my veins. The floor was now a minefield of glass shards, but I didn't slow. I leapt over the broken pedestal, dodging a frantic curator who was wringing her hands over the ruined vase. He was fast, weaving through a labyrinth of rolling display cases and terrified staff. He knocked over a stack of empty crates, sending them clattering across my path. I hurdled them, my eyes locked on his retreating form. He burst through a set of double doors leading into a narrow, dimly lit service corridor, the clang of metal echoing behind him. The wolf was running, but I was right on his heels, determined to drag him back to his den. The chase was on, high stakes and terrifyingly personal, just as I knew it would be. This wasn't the pristine, brightly lit gallery floor. This was the forgotten underbelly, a maze of stacked crates, unsold canvases shrouded in plastic, and office cubicles crammed with obsolete paperwork. The muffled din of the impending record sale, a murmur of anticipation from the main hall, felt distant, unreal. He knew these passages, these shortcuts, better than I did. Every turn was a gamble, a burst of adrenaline as I pushed past towering shelves laden with forgotten porcelain and antique furniture. The stale coffee smell intensified in one section, leading past a small, disused office, papers yellowed with age scattered on a desk. His office, I realized, the scent a signature I hadn't consciously registered until now. It was a detail, small and seemingly innocuous, that suddenly clicked into place. He ducked behind a row of intricately carved wooden screens, a collection awaiting cataloging. I followed, my breath ragged, my mind racing to anticipate his next move. The sounds of the auction house's administrative heart, distant phones, the clack of keyboards, were fading, replaced by the thud of our footsteps. He was leading me deeper, towards the older, less frequented storage vaults, where the air grew heavy with the scent of aged paper and something else, something metallic and old, like forgotten iron. Finally, in a cavernous space filled with enormous tarpaulin-draped shapes that hinted at monumental sculptures, I cornered him. He stood panting, his back to a wall of ancient stacked sarcophagi. Replicas, I hoped, but unsettlingly authentic in the dim light filtering from a high window. His eyes, wild and cornered, met mine. It was the curator, Elias Thorne, a man whose expertise in ancient artifacts had once been lauded, now revealed as the architect of a series of meticulously orchestrated horrors. "It's over, Elias," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "The ritual ends here." He scoffed, a dry, humorless sound. "Ritual? You speak of rituals, Marcus?" The first victim found near the old observatory, marked with the symbol of the Watcher. The second, a linguist near the ancient library's ruins, branded with the Speaker. The third, an archivist, at the city's oldest crossroads, the Keeper. Each a grotesque recreation of the ancient summoning of the three voices, a forgotten cult's desperate attempt to awaken a lost oracle. His eyes widened, a flicker of genuine surprise breaking through his composure. You understood the sequence?" "More than that, Elias. I understood your mistake," I pressed, my gaze unwavering. The cult's texts specified a very particular type of binding agent for their symbols, a resin derived from a now-extinct tree. You, in your desperation to replicate perfection, used a modern synthetic polymer, chemically almost identical, but with a unique isotopic signature. I found it, Elias. Traces on the victims, on the Watcher's telescope, on the Speaker's tongue, on the Keeper's hands. And then, finally, in the residue I scraped from the floor of that stale-smelling office you kept hidden here, next to the very texts you used for your blueprint. He stared, his face draining of color. The stale coffee, the dust. It wasn't just background noise. It was the residue of his obsession, the scent of his planning. "You believed that by enacting these sacrifices, you could unlock the knowledge of the first voice, didn't you?" I continued, pushing my advantage. "That these modern victims, representing the Watcher, Speaker, and Keeper, would somehow complete an ancient circuit, revealing secrets you felt the world had forgotten. That the record sale today, with its focus on a newly discovered tablet detailing the lost oracle, was your final stage, a public declaration of your success." A low growl rumbled in his chest. "They were blind. They dismissed the true power of the ancients. I merely sought to prove it." He lunged, a desperate, clumsy move, reaching for a heavy bronze paperweight on a nearby crate. But I was ready. My experience, honed by countless hours dissecting crime scenes, allowed me to react. I sidestepped, grabbing his arm, twisting it behind his back with practiced ease. The paperweight clattered harmlessly to the floor. Just then, burst into the vault, his pistol drawn, followed by two uniformed officers. They had followed my earlier frantic call, guided by the ping of my tracker. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I confirmed, maintaining my grip on Thorne. "He's confessed, Detective. Not in words, but in his recognition of the ritual, in the chemical signature of his work. Elias Thorne is the perpetrator. He meticulously planned these murders, each victim chosen for their symbolic connection to a long-lost ancient cult, believing he could resurrect an oracle, unlock a historical conspiracy. The historical conspiracy he sought to revive wasn't one of grand power, but one of a twisted mind, warped by forgotten texts and a dangerous delusion, and synthetic polymers, and finally, unmasked the truth. The auction's record sale would proceed, but the real historical revelation had just been made in the quiet, dusty backrooms. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoed, a stark, final sound in the opulent backroom of the auction house. Nodded at me, a silent acknowledgement of the battle won, but the victory felt heavy, coated in the dust of centuries. The room began to clear, the uniformed officers securing evidence, the other investigators exchanging low-voiced remarks. I remained standing amidst the display tables, the air still thick with the residue of confrontation. My own hands, which had trembled with adrenaline just moments before, now felt strangely numb. The case was closed. Justice for victims separated by generations had finally been served. I ran a finger over the smooth, cool surface of an ancient bronze amulet, one of the many artifacts Thorne had coveted. For weeks, I had been driven by a relentless pursuit, an unyielding need to uncover the truth. Now, with the chase over, the emotional and professional toll began its insidious climb. My professional life had always been a quest for patterns, for the logical threads that connected crime to motive. But this case, this was different. It had ripped open the very fabric of history, revealing not just a hidden conspiracy, but a lineage of malevolence stretching back to forgotten times. It wasn't just about a single killer or a single victim. It was about the silent suffering of countless individuals whose stories had been deliberately erased. Their stories, denied for so long, were finally told. It was a profound, sobering thought, a heavy mantle of responsibility. The exhaustion was a physical ache, deep in my bones. But beneath it was something else, a new kind of weariness, an awareness that had changed me irrevocably fundamentally. The world, which I had once viewed through a lens of contemporary understanding, now seemed layered with spectral echoes, resonant with the past. The auction house, preparing for its record-breaking sale, felt like a superficial veneer over the ancient earth, hiding untold stories beneath its polished floors. The value placed on these artifacts, the thrill of acquisition, seemed almost grotesque when contrasted with the genuine, brutal history they represented. Approached, a hand on my shoulder. "It's over, Marcus. You did good." I nodded, unable to articulate the complex tangle of triumph and despair that warred within me. He paused, his gaze thoughtful. "For Thorne, yes. For the victims, their peace. For us, we carry it." He was right. I would carry this. It wasn't just Thorne who was an anomaly. It was the sheer resilience of the evil he embodied, the ancient evils that seemed to resurface. Not as mythological beasts, but as human ideologies, as corrosive as any poison. This case wasn't just a professional milestone. It was a profound personal reckoning. It had forced me to confront the uncomfortable truth that history isn't merely a collection of facts, but a living, breathing entity, capable of influencing the present in ways we rarely comprehend. It was a warning. I looked around the back room one last time, at the crates waiting to be opened, the hushed preparations for the grand sale. Life would go on. But for me, the lingering echoes would remain, could always find fertile ground in the next. My world had expanded, becoming more complex, more perilous, but also, in a strange way, more profoundly meaningful, waiting for their moment to rise again. And with that knowledge, I knew my work, in a sense, had only just begun.